portrait of a lonely human being who doesn't know anything about himself, who has very little identity. His identity comes from what people say about him, what people write about him, and the people who take his picture, but he doesn't have any familiarity with what within him.
A portrait of a lost human being, someone who knows nothing about himself. He carries little sense of identity, defined only by what others say about him, what's written about him, or the pictures taken of him. But when he looks inward, he finds nothing familiar. A Steven Spielberg, one of the most respected directors in Hollywood history. For over half a century, he has given audiences masterpieces like Jaws, E.T., and Schindler's List, constantly redefining the power of cinema. Yet even Spielberg has faced conflicts behind the camera. Known for his strict discipline, he demands professionalism and respect on set. And when that balance is broken, he never forgets. In this video, we'll uncover 6 actors Spielberg disliked working with and the real stories behind their falling out. First on the list, Julia Roberts. For Spielberg, discipline is the foundation of his empire. To him, filmmaking isn't just art, it's a sacred collaboration where everyone must arrive prepared, responsible, and precise. And no matter how famous, actors exist to serve the story. So, when Julia Roberts, Hollywood's new golden girl after Pretty Woman, signed on to play Tinker Bell in Hook, 1991, it seemed like the perfect match. Spielberg would reimagine Peter Pan, Roberts would bring star power, and together they would create magic. But instead of magic, the set turned into a battleground. Roberts, barely in her 20s and struggling under the crushing weight of sudden fame, found herself in uncharted territory. Tinker Bell demanded endless green screen work, complex technical tricks, and isolation from her co-stars. While Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman exchanged energy and chemistry on set, Roberts stood alone, acting opposite tennis balls and oversized props. On set, crew members began to whisper. Julia Roberts seemed distant, withdrawn, and the gossip grew cruel. Some even branded her with a harsh nickname, Tinkerhell. The timing couldn't have been worse. Her personal life was in turmoil. Roberts's highly publicized engagement to Kiefer Sutherland had collapsed, and as Hook fell behind schedule, filming stretched right into what should have been her wedding day. Years later, Roberts admitted how isolated she felt during that period. "I was going through a really difficult time in my life, and I felt completely unsupported. It was like the people I thought would have my back didn't." Meanwhile, Steven Spielberg was battling ballooning costs and a production that ran 40 days over schedule. His patience wore thin. To him, Roberts's unpredictable absences only fueled the chaos. Later, when asked about the experience, Spielberg's response was polite but telling, "It was an unfortunate time for us to be working together." For Hollywood insiders, that was all they needed to know. Spielberg, a director rarely known for criticizing his stars, never collaborated with Roberts again. But Roberts refused to stay quiet. In a 1999 Vanity Fair interview, she confessed how betrayed she felt when Spielberg didn't defend her against the Tinkerhell rumors. Hand to God. "Not a thing I read about that was truthful, and it really hurt my feelings. I couldn't believe that this person I knew and trusted was actually hesitating to come to my defense. It was the first time I felt I had a turncoat in my midst." Her words were sharp, revealing not just a professional disagreement, but a personal wound. To Roberts, Spielberg, the man who had built his legacy protecting actors, had turned his back on her when she needed it most. On set, tensions only deepened. Dustin Hoffman, a notorious perfectionist, pushed scene after scene to the breaking point. Robin Williams, with his endless improvisations, kept morale high but stretched filming hours even longer. Meanwhile, Julia Roberts, confined to her green screen stages, withdrew further into isolation. Steven Spielberg, under relentless pressure from the studio to justify an $80 million budget spiraling out of control, had little patience left for fragility. As their creative worlds collided, Spielberg's need for order against Roberts's struggle with chaos. And when Hook finally reached theaters, the response was mixed. Critics slammed it as bloated and uneven, but audiences embraced it just enough to make it a box office success. Still, for Roberts and Spielberg, the fallout was permanent. He never cast her again. And that silence spoke louder than words. For a director famous for reuniting with actors like Tom Hanks, Harrison Ford, and Richard Dreyfuss, the absence of Roberts in his later films was impossible to ignore. She, in turn, carried the sting of that experience for years. "It was a hard lesson to learn," she admitted later. And while she eventually outgrew the cruel Tinker Hell label, the story still lingers in Hollywood lore. To this day, their professional distance remains absolute. No reunion, no cameo, no whispered project. Their only collaboration was Hook, and both have since described it as one of the most difficult productions of their careers. Number 2. Robert Shaw. Spielberg was only 27 when he walked onto the set of Jaws. He had vision, ambition, and a script that could change the face of the thriller forever. But he also had Robert Shaw, an actor as brilliant as he was volatile. On screen, Shaw was electric. His portrayal of Quint, the hardened shark hunter, gave the film its grit and gravity. But off-screen, chaos. A heavy drinker and fiercely old-school, Shaw had no patience for the polished Hollywood-style Spielberg tried to maintain on set. He constantly mocked Richard Dreyfuss, the young newcomer playing Hooper, with endless jabs. Spielberg later reflected, "It was like he was testing him." Robert was old school. He thought Richard was a little too green, and he wanted to remind him of that. At one point, Shaw even dared Dreyfuss to perform a dangerous boat stunt, knowing full well the younger actor would refuse. To Robert Shaw, the jabs and confrontations weren't cruelty, they were a way of hardening his co-stars. But to Steven Spielberg, it was a nightmare to control. The tension grew so infamous that Spielberg himself labeled it the Great Shaw-Dreyfuss Feud. Over the years, Richard Dreyfuss has softened the memory. Robert was tough, but I think he also liked to stir the pot. He wasn't just picking on me. He was making the film more real by making us feel what our characters felt. But for Spielberg, the problem went far beyond clashing personalities. The production of Jaws was already teetering on disaster. The mechanical shark, nicknamed Bruce, kept breaking down. The schedule spiraled out of control. Tempers flared. And Shaw, brilliant though he was, only made the chaos harder to contain. Crew members remembered a man who swung wildly between genius and menace. One day, he delivered the haunting USS Indianapolis monologue in a single breathtaking take, leaving the entire set in silence. The next, he'd be drinking heavily, goading Dreyfuss, and snapping at Spielberg, questioning the young director's authority. Years later, Spielberg admitted, "Robert was a force of nature. He terrified me as much off-camera as he did on it." As for Shaw, he never apologized. Asked about the reports of tension, he brushed them off bluntly, "I don't suffer fools. If that makes me difficult, so be it." In a strange twist, that friction may have actually fueled the film. The raw hostility between Quint, Hooper, and Brody felt authentic, because in many ways, it was. Spielberg walked away from Jaws both traumatized and triumphant, having wrestled not only with a failing shark prop, but with Shaw's stormy presence. Yet the truth is, Spielberg never worked with Shaw again. He respected him, even called him brilliant, but made it clear the experience had been harrowing. Just 3 years later, in 1978, Shaw died at the age of 51. Whatever tension remained between them ended not with reconciliation, but with silence. Today, Spielberg still calls Jaws the movie that nearly ended his career before it began. And while he always praises Shaw's unforgettable performance, the subtext is unmistakable. Robert Shaw gave him one of cinema's greatest characters, and some of the worst days of his life. Which brings us to number 3,
Sean Young.
Sean Young. For all his diplomacy, Steven Spielberg has limits. And with Young, those limits were tested. In the early 1980s, Sean Young seemed destined for stardom. Fresh off Stripes and on the verge of becoming iconic in Blade Runner, she was a rising name. When she auditioned for Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark, her screen tests impressed nearly everyone. According to Young, she was flown to California twice for callbacks and left convinced she was Spielberg's choice to play Marion Ravenwood in Raiders of the Lost Arkansas. But when the role ultimately went to Karen Allen, Young didn't let it go. At a New Year's Eve party in the Hollywood Hills, she confronted Spielberg directly. "You misled me. I thought I was going to get the part." Normally composed, Spielberg snapped back, "I did not mislead you. I did not." Clearly offended, his reaction caught Young off guard. She later recalled trying to defuse the moment. "Whoa, calm down. I didn't mean it like you were a bad guy or anything. I just really thought I was going to get the part. You flew me back twice." But the damage was already done. For a director who valued loyalty and professionalism above all else, being accused, especially in public, of dishonesty was unforgivable. To Spielberg, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a warning sign. A rumor soon circulated that Spielberg saw Young as unpredictable, someone who even violated confidentiality by leaking production details to the press. Her chaotic energy clashed with his famously controlled sets, and trust between them evaporated. As one insider put it simply, she had the talent, but Steven didn't trust her. For Young, the rejection cut deeper than just losing a role. It felt personal. Years later, in an interview with the Daily Beast, she unleashed her frustrations. "Steven has enough power to cancel you. He canceled Megan Fox, and he canceled me." She went even further, naming Spielberg, Ridley Scott, and Warren Beatty as directors who, in her words, derailed her career by branding her difficult. Steven Spielberg never attacked Sean Young publicly. That wasn't his style. But his silence spoke volumes. After their confrontation, he simply never cast her again. And for a director known for reusing and rewarding his favorite actors, Tom Hanks, Richard Dreyfuss, Harrison Ford, the absence of Young said more than words ever could. To this day, the rift has never been mended. Young continues to describe Spielberg as one of the powerful men who blacklisted her in Hollywood. Spielberg, meanwhile, just moved forward, rarely even mentioning her name. Their feud didn't end with screaming matches or public scandals. It ended with something colder: erasure. For all her talent and intensity, Sean Young became one of the rare actors Spielberg refused to ever work with again. And in Hollywood, silence can be the harshest verdict of all. Which brings us to Number
5.
Robert Duvall.
Robert Duvall.
In Hollywood, director-actor conflicts usually come down to creative choices, differences in vision, in style, or in how to handle the pressure of a massive production. And when the names Steven Spielberg and Robert Duvall clashed, it wasn't over a role or a film set. It was over politics. For Spielberg, 2002 was meant to be a gesture of cultural diplomacy. He traveled to Havana as part of a U.S.-authorized cultural exchange, bringing 8 of his films to be screened for thousands of Cubans. He visited Havana's Jewish community, paid respects at the city's Holocaust Memorial, and even met with U.S. diplomats. But the headlines weren't about diplomacy. They were about a single meeting: Spielberg's sit-down with Fidel Castro. Duvall, one of America's most respected actors, didn't stay quiet. On 60 Minutes too, he went straight for the throat. How could someone like Spielberg, who makes films about democracy and freedom, sit down with a dictator like that? Then came the cutting sarcasm. Would you consider building a little annex on the Holocaust Museum, or at least across the street, to honor the dead Cubans Castro killed? This wasn't just criticism, it was outright condemnation. And Duvall made sure the world heard it. That's very presumptuous of him to go there. I'll never work at DreamWorks again, but I don't care about working there anyway. Spielberg, blindsided, chose his response carefully. A spokesman clarified that the trip was cultural, not political, an opportunity to share his films and values with the Cuban people. The statement stressed that Duvall had mischaracterized him, noting the visit had been fully approved by the U.S. government under a legal cultural exchange. But the damage was done. Duvall's words reframed Spielberg, not as a filmmaker on a goodwill mission, but as a man cozying up to a dictator. And in post-9/11 America, with George W. Bush hardening a Cuba policy, the optics were brutal. Behind the scenes, Insiders say Spielberg was deeply disappointed. He had long admired Duvall's body of work, from The Godfather to Apocalypse Now, and had even once considered him a natural fit for projects at DreamWorks. After the public attack, Steven Spielberg quietly closed the door. There would be no partnership with Robert Duvall. And Duvall, for his part, never softened. Years later, in interviews, he doubled down, "I just don't get it. Spielberg shouldn't have gone there. Period." To Duvall, this wasn't about art, it was about principle. Unlike Spielberg's on-set tensions with Julia Roberts or Robert Shaw, this wasn't a clash that faded once the cameras stopped rolling. This was ideological, deep, unforgivable. And so, the story ended before it even began. Spielberg and Duvall never worked together. No collaborations. No reconciliations. Just silence. Today, their paths remain worlds apart. Spielberg continues to cement his place as one of cinema's greatest storytellers, while Duvall, now in his 90s, stays outspoken, never afraid to aim criticism at what he finds unacceptable.
Ryan O'Neal stands out, not for the work they created.
Unlike others on this list, O'Neal's story with Spielberg isn't about a movie they made together, but about one that never happened. On paper, the pairing looked perfect. Ryan O'Neal, one of the biggest stars of the 1970s thanks to Love Story and Paper Moon. Steven Spielberg, the fast-rising young director searching for leading men to carry his ambitious projects. For a brief moment, their paths aligned. But the moment they sat down together, the cracks were obvious. O'Neal carried himself like a classic Hollywood star, expecting script rewrites, special treatment, and deference from his directors. Spielberg, on the other hand, was forging a new path. He believed in collaboration, treating everyone on set, from headliners to background extras, with the same level of respect. And he expected that same humility in return. Production designer Norman Reynolds later summed it up, "Steven treated everyone the same." That clash was evident right away. Meetings grew tense. O'Neal demanded script changes, pushed for schedule adjustments, and even questioned Spielberg's directing choices. For Spielberg, who valued efficiency and loyalty, this wasn't just a nuisance, it was a violation of everything he believed filmmaking stood for: teamwork. Things only got worse when O'Neal allegedly made offhand, inappropriate remarks about fellow cast members at industry events. To Spielberg, that wasn't just unprofessional, it was betrayal. A loyalty, in his mind, was sacred. Once broken, there was no going back. True to form, Spielberg never launched a public attack on O'Neal. That wasn't his way. But his silence, and his choices, spoke for him. Despite O'Neal's fame, Spielberg quietly moved on, shutting the door on any future collaboration. O'Neal, however, didn't hold back. Friends recalled him dismissing Spielberg as too precious and too self-serious, waving off the director's collaborative style as nothing more than micromanaging. To O'Neal, Spielberg's method was suffocating. To Spielberg, O'Neal's ego was toxic. The fallout was permanent. While other actors from O'Neal's generation found lasting places in Spielberg's universe, O'Neal never did. His reputation for being difficult, combined with Spielberg's refusal to indulge star arrogance, sealed the split forever. They never reconciled. Spielberg moved on, building films around actors who thrived under his structured, disciplined sets. O'Neal, meanwhile, watched as the 1980s reshaped Hollywood, this time without him in Spielberg's orbit. To this day, their relationship remains a what-if, a clash between two Hollywood eras, one rooted in old-school star privilege, the other in a new vision of collaborative filmmaking. Number 6. Marlon Brando. Spielberg built his career on discipline. Every shot, every frame, every camera movement was designed with architectural precision. To him, filmmaking was a careful balance, big visions supported by structure. Brando, however, thrived in chaos. He was Hollywood's wild genius, an actor who treated every role like a private experiment. Where Spielberg demanded control, Brando demanded freedom. And when their worlds finally collided, it was never going to be a true collaboration. It was destined to fracture. On paper, the pairing looked irresistible. Spielberg, the wunderkind reshaping Hollywood blockbusters in the 1970s, and Brando, the living embodiment of modern acting brilliance. To many, it felt like a dream match waiting to happen. But insiders say the reality unraveled almost immediately. Producer Kathleen Kennedy later recalled, Brando operated according to his own creative logic that didn't acknowledge production realities. Spielberg admired Brando's genius, but he couldn't, and wouldn't, bend his meticulous system to fit the chaos that followed the actor onto every set. The breaking point between Steven Spielberg and Marlon Brando came during their earliest creative meetings. Brando pushed hard for script control, insisting on the freedom to improvise major dramatic moments. Spielberg, who meticulously storyboarded every detail, from character blocking to camera lenses, saw those demands as a direct threat to his vision. In private, he later admitted, "You can't build a film around uncertainty. Not at this scale." But Brando was unmoved. To him, filmmaking was never about budgets or schedules. It was about chasing truth. He once quipped to a friend, in what many believe was a jab at Spielberg, "Some people make movies like clockmakers. I prefer to smash the clock and see what happens." Their incompatibility ran so deep that entire projects collapsed before they even began. Spielberg admired Brando's groundbreaking performances, but privately confessed he found him impossible to direct. Brando, meanwhile, dismissed Spielberg as part of the Hollywood machine, directors more concerned with box office than the raw messiness of art. What made the clash especially tragic was the potential that never materialized. Brando's revolutionary approach to character work could have thrived under Spielberg's technical mastery. Together, they might have created something truly historic. Instead, their philosophies canceled each other out. No films, no second chances, just aborted attempts and stories of meetings that ended in stalemate. Unlike other Hollywood tensions that eventually faded, this one remained frozen in place. Spielberg stayed diplomatic, continuing to praise Brando's genius while acknowledging how difficult he could be. Brando, until his death in 2004, never softened either, remaining skeptical of the blockbuster system Spielberg helped to shape. Today, their relationship is remembered not as a bitter feud but as a missed opportunity, a clash of two titans who stood on opposite ends of what cinema should be. Spielberg, the craftsman of control, and Brando, the prophet of chaos, left behind only silence where there could have been collaboration. And in the bigger picture, these stories serve as a reminder that even a director as legendary as Steven Spielberg is not immune to conflict. Behind the flawless blockbusters and timeless classics lie tales of clashing egos, creative disagreements, and personalities that simply could not coexist. Whether sparked by politics, professionalism, or pure chaos, Spielberg always drew a line. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back.